So here's something you may or may not know about me. I'm decidedly not a night owl. You know those birds who you can hear singing or hooting in the moonlight? That's not me. I'm more like one of those birds who sing around sunset maybe, and then goes right to bed. I don't like to go out much at night, never have. In fact, one of the things I love about this church is that we don't have evening meetings. When the sun's going down, I like to be at home, relaxing, winding down from a productive day. Can any one of you relate at all? Are there any night owls in the room? There's a couple. There's a couple here as well. Now, this all goes out the window with my hobby of ultra trail running. These longer races typically extend well beyond 24 hours for average Joes like my friends and me, which means at one point or another, we will be running in the dark for hours. In the woods, well past my bedtime of 10 p.m. And it's during these moments in the dark of a race that people typically hit a low point. Fatigued from running all day, beginning from sunrise, is eventually adding up all these hours on top of one another. And the body reminds you that, hey, it's dark out, time to go to bed. The fun and the exuberance of running the beautiful trails through the mountains during the sunshine of the day turns into the drudgery of slowly plodding along the course. What feels more like a death march at times instead of frolicking through the mountains. Now like zombies through the darkness. The only visual stimulation coming from one's beam of light extending from your headlamp a few feet in front of you. It can all feel rather hopeless in times like these. But then there's a moment or two that shakes you awake back to your senses, into full awareness of your surroundings. Perhaps it's a hoot of an owl, or coming upon a rushing stream, or the silhouette of a tree against a backdrop of a moonlight, or the millions of stars in the sky. And it's then where you remember just how lucky you are to be outside doing what you love to be doing, enjoying nature, pushing your gift of an able body beyond previously conceived physical, mental, and emotional limits, participating in an adventure and experience that is so much bigger than your otherwise rather small and predictable life. It's the stars above that remind me of how small I am in this endless cosmos, and at the same time how intimately loved I am as a uniquely beloved child of God, exquisitely created in God's own image. And it's then in those moments of the darkness I think to myself, how awesome is this? Now, sometimes we forget that last part. We as humans, we often experience the darkness, the tough moments, the times when we experience isolation, suffering, and doubt in our lives. And instead of gratitude, we ask ourselves, is this what it means to be human these days? To merely experience hardship each and every day and then to die? And also, just as an aside, that question is also asked while running through the woods in the middle of the night during an ultra race. Now, I don't believe that to be the case for our human experiences. In fact, it's my belief that these struggles in life help us to deepen our relationship with a God who intimately loves us, who promises a good future for us, and who desires a relationship of trust and faith with us as the created reflections of God's self that each of us are. As we continue within our series on learning more about the faith of Abram and Sarai, today we are invited to reflect on the relationship between God and the created world as we lean further into faithfulness within our own spiritual journeys this morning. And so let us get back to this fantastic story, again beginning with Genesis chapter 14. We're going to be specifically focusing on chapter 15 this morning, but just previously in chapter 14, there's this incredible battle narrative that takes place like a Shakespearean wartime drama. Lot, Abram's nephew, is captured and taken hostage by enemy armies, only to have Abram and his small but fierce group of men track down these enemies, best them in battle, and rescue Lot from further harm. And it seems, as we reflect upon the last few chapters now, that for Abram and Sarai, life is rarely easy. And yet, these daily struggles continue to highlight Abram's faith in God, trusting in God's plans for a good future. These challenges lead to chapter 15, known as perhaps one of the more important sections of the Abrahamic narrative as Abram and God speak once again. Last week we remember from chapter 12 of God's initial blessing and promise as Abram is set out in faith. And today we read of a new term, a covenant, which means a holy pact or agreement that is enacted between God on one hand and on Abram on the other. The conversation begins similarly to last week's chat between God and Abram, with God promising protection for Abram, and then God includes a small addition to such promises, which we read in verse 1. God says, "Your reward, Abram, shall be very great." And Abram's response is understandable, right? I can imagine Abram saying something like this: "Yeah, so about your promises, God. I appreciate your protection and all, really, but up to this point I've had to escape a famine. I've had to sell my wife to Pharaoh," remember that part? "And chase off invaders while rescuing my nephew in a war that I had nothing personally to do with. Oh yeah, and on top of this, God, remember that whole promise about having an heir? Well, I'm not getting any younger, nor is my wife, who is barren, by the way. And again, as I recount, now if I were to die tomorrow, some random servant would be in line to receive my inheritance." But God reiterates the promise previously shared with Abram. You're going to have an heir, and they will be of your own blood. Verse 5 reads that God brought Abram outside and said, "Look toward the heaven and count the stars if you are able to count them." And then God said to Abram, "So shall your descendants be." And Abram believed the Lord, and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness. Righteousness. This is the term used to describe Abram's actions following a rather tumultuous exchange between he and God. But the exchange doesn't end there. God once again reminds Abram of this promise of land to be his and his descendants. Abram once again asks how exactly he is to know that these promises are going to come to be realized. There's this whole Old Testament sacrifice scene that we read about. There's this illusion of going back to the story of creation itself, with Abram falling into a deep sleep, much like our first character, Adam, in Genesis chapter 1 and 2, as God continues to move throughout the story. And then God shares some rather hard news to hear once again for Abram at this time. He says, okay, Abram, so here's the deal. You know that land I'm promising you? Well, it's going to take a while. And I can imagine Abram asking God, well, about how long are you thinking? Like a month? No? A year? And God responds, no, like 400 years? In fact, what's going to happen is that your entire people will need to first suffer in slavery for 4 generations. It's going to get dark. Really dark. But ultimately, they will prevail. And you? Well, you're going to be okay, Abram, because you're going to live a good, long life and die peacefully. And amazingly, Abram accepts this news. Or maybe a better word that we can use. Faithfully, Abram accepts this news. He continues to trust in God's plans. And maybe at this point, we are left to question why Abram sticks around with God in the first place. After all, this seems to be a rather dysfunctional relationship, right? There's clearly an uneven power dynamic at play here, and Abram has been left to struggle with just about every turn in his life. And yet, Abram remains faithful. And why is this, we may ask? As we think about our good news for us today, our lives of faith are further developed within a committed relationship with our Creator. As we continue forward within our lives of faith today, we are blessed to develop a deep relationship with our God. And yes, there will be rocky times ahead. At no point does God ever say, great news, you won the human condition lottery today. You know how everyone else suffers in this world? Well, that's not going to happen to you. You're going to have the best time. No worries at all. And maybe there's a person or two that you can think of where you may wish to challenge such a notion that no person is exempt from suffering. But I assure you, friends, that they too have encountered suffering and struggle at one point or another in their lives as well. And yes, like any relationship that we experience in our lives, there will be rocky times. But as we also know from previous experiences of relationship in our lives, that these challenging moments also tend to be the most formative, and dare I say, valuable for a relationship to develop moving forward. How have our challenges and hardships in our lives helped to shape us, who we are today? To further evolve and mature our relationship with our God. In First Presbyterian, you are no strangers to hardship as a church either. This church has likewise experienced its own hardships and rocky moments. And yet, God continues to promise a great future for those who persevere in faithfulness. God continues to call First Presbyterian forward in faith in the days and years ahead. This congregation has been molded and made stronger within its faith journey throughout these now 200 plus years. Friends, when life gets tough, we understandably have our questions and our doubts. Maybe it's not the race we imagine taking place in front of us. Maybe it's not the church we imagine. Maybe it's not the life we imagine. And yet, God is still with us. God says all of these bumps and bruises along the way, I can work with this. In fact, I can turn these challenging moments into opportunities for strength and for transformation. Friends, a covenant has been made with the people of God, the descendants of Abraham. God will never leave us. There is a bright future ahead. And so tonight, as we look up to those ancient stars once again, may we be reminded of God's good plans for our lives, for the life of God's people, for the life of this church. And for this, we give all thanks and praise. Alleluia. Amen.